Hi everyone, welcome back to Chitheads. My special guest today is Matthew Remski. Matthew Remski has been practicing meditation since 1996 and asana since 2000. He's taught yoga, yoga philosophy, and Ayurveda in Toronto and beyond since 2005. He maintains an active Ayurveda consultation practice from his home, which he shares with his partner Alex and their son Jacob. He's authored several books on yoga and related subjects and is working towards completing What Are We Actually Doing in Asana, an examination of pain, injury, and healing in modern yoga, which we're also going to talk a little bit about today. His blog, his very popular blog, hosts an average of 20,000 readers per month, and you can find that blog at matthewremski.com/WordPress. Is that correct, Matthew?
Yeah, that should be it. I think .com would get people there anyway. Yeah.
Okay, great. So hello, how are you?
Good, thanks, Jacob.
Good.
Thanks for taking the time today.
Yes, it's and I just want to be upfront with our listeners that this is actually the third time we're attempting this interview, which has never happened before. But I'm looking forward to the third time. The first time we sort of decided that we wanted to tackle some of our sensitive topics again, and then the second time I was in rare form. So we'll talk a little bit that in a bit, and sort of I do want to go to sort of get into the sensitive details, or kind of the vulnerable details, I guess, about why I felt so defensive in that particular interview. But I want to wait for that juicy stuff for a little bit. But
Sure.
First, I would love to open the floor for you to talk a little bit about your story. You know, I think you inhabit a very interesting position and a very important position, I think, in the yoga scene, in that, you know, you have a critical voice, but you're also very learned and sensitive to a lot of the issues that have been happening around trauma, sensitivity, and so I would love to just kind of hear a little bit about your story and what led you to the practice of yoga, and what has kind of informed your very unique perspective, I would say, on the practices of yoga.
All right. Well, it's a little bit hard to start at the beginning, but
Right.
if I were to choose a moment that really brings a number of things into focus with my present, interests and research, I'd have to say that in 2007, I'd been practicing asana for about 7 years, and I was in a weekend immersion with a very famous teacher who is internationally renowned, loved by many. He's kind of a senior figure in a number of different asana worlds. And
I take it from your ambiguity that you don't feel like sharing that.
Yeah, I'll name names in the actual book, and what's cool is that this particular person has agreed to be interviewed about it, and so that's coming up in November, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what he has to say about what I'm going to describe. But and what I'm going to describe isn't that extraordinary. It's happens thousands upon thousands of times, but it jostled me into a series of connections that I think have been unconsciously driving me for a long time now. It was at the end of the weekend. I enjoyed the precise, detailed work that we were doing. I felt that I had learned a lot, although, as it was in the Iyengar mode, there was also something of kind of like an instructional overwhelm that I think is part of the point. Your cognitive self gets battered in a way, so that somehow some kind of instinct takes over, some new muscle awakens inside, and I enjoyed that process for a while. It's not really what I do anymore when I do physical practice, but we got to the end of the weekend. I'm pretty sure that I was exhausted and worn out, and I was in Parivrita Trikonasana, and following all the instructions and looking at the clock kind of, and he quietly approached from behind. I mean, so quiet that I didn't hear him. Put one foot on my back foot to stabilize it. Somehow anchored me with his own pelvis, and then wrenched my spine deeply into the twist, like impossibly deep into the twist, and I felt what felt like every single vertebrae in my spine cracked, just like a kind of like a I don't know, Velcro ripping or something like that, and what was amazing was that it was painful, but it was also elating, and this surge of complex sensations really flowed out of that moment. Like he let me go. I crumpled to the floor. He walked away. He went off onto the next person, and
you crumpled to the floor.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
yeah. I mean, if you're in that posture and twisted much farther than you've been accustomed to, and you're doing that through the support of
someone else,
of the person who's adjusted you. There's you're not gonna suddenly find a new source of balance. So I didn't, and he walked on, and this was just kind of par for the course. And I think one of the weird things about this style of teaching is that it has taken about 30 years for people like me and other people my age to figure out that actually this was happening all the time to everybody, because the thing that happens after an encounter like that is that you internalize, you kind of try to regather yourself, you create a bubble of recovery for about 10 minutes. You don't realize that he's probably adjusted 3 more people like that on the same time until you start talking to them 10 years later. and then you say, oh, okay, well, did that happen to you as well? So anyway, the connections that emerged happened slowly but very powerfully. And they came out of the bodily sensations of it. And the bodily sensations were, yes, pain, but also elation. I mean, as we go into stress positions, there's explosions of opiate release and endorphins and all kinds of adrenalizing functions that allow you to survive whatever it is you're experiencing. And of course, your body doesn't know how deeply it's injured yet, and so it doesn't know how much it has to protect you. And I got the adjustment on one side and not the other side, so I kind of walked around for the next week or so like I had like I was a car with my 2 left tires flat or something, sort of listing to one side because I was, I don't know, mildly scoliotic from the adjustment. It was so powerful. It was so powerful. But the other thing was that I was flooded with warmth. Mm-hmm. I was flooded with a kind of appreciation as well that it wasn't worse. Mm-hmm. It was flooded with a kind of a sense of I don't know, even this weird kind of gratitude that I've been given the attention. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But at the same time, my back pain, which then developed into about a year's worth of trouble, gradually, amplified. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing: the real shock came when I remembered that the only thing that really reminded me of that, like it wasn't an unfamiliar sensation. Mm-hmm. The only thing that reminded me of this, or the thing that this reminded me of, rather, is my experience in a Catholic boys' school in Toronto called St. Michael's Choir School that I went to from 3rd grade to 12th grade, mm-hmm. Where even though corporal punishment was outlawed in the city of Toronto in 1971, this particular school just really, like the rest of the Catholic Church, felt itself to be above civil law and didn't really pay any attention to that. And so corporal punishment from the age of about 7 through to 16 was a normal, everyday, common experience, either within my own body or watching it happen to other people, other boys. And the same mechanisms apply. That you don't know that it's coming, that it's just accepted. There's no sense of consent or anything like that. There's no the educational principle is in loco parentis, right? The old Latin idea, Latinate, and then Renaissance idea that the schooling environment is taking the place of the parent, and the parent owns the body of the child, therefore the school owns the body of the child. That's like basically what was the rule in this particular classroom. And I remembered the same complex of sensations in school, that I would be flooded with warmth. I would be elated that it was over. I would be proud that I'd survived it. Mm-hmm. It could become a point of boasting or one-upmanship amongst the other boys, that, oh, I got something worse than you, but I'm still laughing, and then the other thing that is involved with it is that there's an eroticism. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's an intimacy that breaks a particular kind of bodily taboo. Certainly in the Catholic school environment, less so in the yoga environment, but the same principle applies, where the kind of full-on bodily contact signifies a kind of non-cognitive attention that we just don't really have in our repressed lives. And because it's brief, it's forceful, it can be painful, but there's also some edge of, I don't know, it's cutting through a kind of physical repression. It's laying some kind of intimate violence bare. And for that reason, there's something darkly sexual or sexualizable about it. And I think that's why, corporal punishment is its own like porn category in that form of culture. I think it plays into, we see it as a trope in BDSM and all kinds of other places. And so putting these two things together, which took a while, because this is a deep bodily memory from childhood of non-consensual discipline / abuse. Putting these two things together made me wonder, okay, well, is there a historical or a social connection as well? Is there a way in which these central pedagogical norms of modern postural yoga, actually carry some of the same principles of institutionalized schooling, throughout the certainly the European and then colonial era India, that we've come to reject, or most people have come to reject. Does it still exist in these places? And I think one of the deepest historical revelations that I've come to over researching the Wawadia project is that, yeah, absolutely, the pedagogy of modern postural yoga comes out of a corporal punishment environment, and to ignore that, or to not really get clear on that in contemporary discussions of consent, power dynamics, who teachers are, what they're responsible for, what historical burdens they carry, what their own traumas might be. To not get clear on that means that the discussion of consent and trauma sensitivity in modern yoga really is open to attacks, the attacks of political correctness, or this stuff is all coming out of universities, or it's trendy or something like that. And I would say it's not trendy. It's just a fact that we are coming out of decades and decades and decades of educational norms, where power hierarchies allow certain attitudes towards student bodies to be normalized. That's not how I began in yoga, though. Your question was, how did you get started? If that's where I started, I certainly wouldn't have stayed, for sure. Although there's something very stimulating about encountering a similar circumstance to childhood, and I think we have to remember that as well. That the yoga space is a very intimate space. It is often it's a space of heavy transference and countertransference. It's been broadcast globally through these family lineages that people idolize. It is a family invoking, some people won't like me saying this, but it's a Freud heavy space.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to actually bring that up because, as you're discussing, the kind of formative historical sociological ways that we are, embedded in certain matrices of power, I felt very much like you were approaching a kind of psychoanalytic reading of yoga, which I think is very interesting and definitely very helpful. And so I'm wondering a little bit if you think that there is...
But it's problematic. It's also very problematic.
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah. And I guess, do you think that one of the resistances to engaging in this kind of investigation is the same kind of resistance that would lead someone to, not approach psychotherapeutic measures, but rather seek for something like a pill or a quick fix prescription? And the quick fix prescription in this instance would be kind of the mystique around, or the mysteriousness that can kind of shroud Indian culture or yogic culture in a way that resists investigation, or
yeah, I think so. I think Orientalism, Romanticism, these are very powerful bromides, mm-hmm. and I think we the recent history of modern yoga is littered with examples of folks who choose to adopt new identities rather than really address the ones they have, yeah. and so. Yeah, I think that the quick fixery of devotionalism, of othering and self-othering, for sure, it allows people to avoid the fact that, well, they might actually be in this yoga class because it has some significant resonances with, interrelational power dynamics that they experienced very early on. Yeah. It might become a way of spiritualizing or neutralizing certain relational dynamics that they weren't able to get over. And this is where when I talk to somebody like Victor Van Kooten about his experience with Mr. Iyengar, and he says to me in an interview, he's sitting in Lesbos, Greece, and we're doing it by Skype. I said, he's describing, Iyengar's persistent physical abuse of him. And I said, well, was there any point at which his abuse, his physical battery became intolerable to you? Like what, why, how did you find yourself able to stay? And he said, it was never intolerable to me, because I was used to my father beating me. But at least with Mr. Iyengar, I felt like I was getting something. I was being loved in a way. Mm. It's like, well, how long does it take us to get there? That's the question. When we enter into yoga environments that seem familiar in a way, mm-hmm. In ways that we can't tell, that present us with the same problems that we have encountered all of our lives, but in different form, are we going to be able to use it to our advantage or cover it over? That's the mystery. Okay. That's the mystery of repetition compulsion. Just to go back to Freud a little bit, is do you find yourself in this situation, this power dynamic with a teacher because it's familiar to you, and is that familiarity a kind of consolation? and will you repeat the situation as in an attempt to master it, in an attempt to transform it. Some people can, and I think some people can't.
So then on that note, then I have a question. Do you think that there is ever a kind of power neutrality, or is the point just to continuously be conscious of the possibility of hierarchies of power that are repressive? Is it that mode of inquiry is the neutrality, or is there actually a neutral vision of power relations in which one can go into a yoga room and they've kind of anesthetized their socialization in such a way that they are no longer prone to these kinds of abuses?
I don't think so. Whether people are prone to abuses or not is kind of a separate question. But whether or not there's power neutrality, I don't see how that emerges. I mean, like every fabric of my conscious identity is formed by privilege and circumstance and power relations. Not that that's all I am, but it's very difficult to describe that part of myself that's beyond it. Right. Some people would say that's why we go to yoga, is to try to find that part beyond. But I think if you walk into a business in a capitalist space, there's a power dynamic involved with regard to not only how much you're paying, but how much it costs to be in a place that's more or less gentrified. If there's somebody who's instructing, and it's presumed that they have more technical knowledge about biomechanics than you do, that's a form of power. If they have an overbearing, sense of sanctimony, then that can be a form of power. It's very. I don't know about power neutrality. I think I typically think in terms of power dialogue and power conversation. And your point to being aware of that, I think, is crucial. Right. In as far as I understand it, I'm not a psychotherapist, but in psychotherapy, for example, the point isn't to overcome the tendency to transfer and to counter-transfer, because that's pretty much impossible. It would be very difficult to relate to a human being in ways that didn't carry the history of your relations with other human beings. Yeah. Like, I don't know how that would work. But so the point is to be aware of that as part of the dynamic. Mm-hmm. To be aware that when I took this other class, this is a subtler example, but I took this other class recently, actually, actually it's in Lower Manhattan, with another famous teacher who teaches in this gorgeous, rent-controlled loft that she's probably been in for, I don't know, 40 years or something like that, and she has enough room in this loft for 60 people to do this amazing, props heavy class, and people love her, and they've obviously been coming for 15 years, and
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. So yeah. Well, and I really appreciated Jenny Capular's class. It was beautiful. Mm-hmm. And yet there was this moment. I haven't talked to her about this, but and I haven't asked her to interview, but I don't. It's not like some big reveal. But there was this moment where I'm obviously new there. Mm-hmm. She wants to make contact. And she wants to, as most teachers do, wants to form some kind of connection. But she did that by giving me a number of adjustments that were kind of like check-in adjustments. They weren't even. There was one point where I was sitting doing. I guess we were doing alternate nostril breathing at the end, and I had my elbow propped on a couple of blocks, as I typically do, and I'm doing it with my sloppy ass thumb and ring finger way. Of course, it's not the right, with Iyengar wants you to put your hand into this like weird claw and, do it absolutely precisely and probably have a big frown. I don't know. It's like, there's the instructions out the wazoo. So she comes, she corrects my hand, and that's kind of funny. And it's, but then she comes and she touches my head to reorient my head tilt by like probably a fraction of a degree. And I'm like, I have been sitting and meditating for 20 years, and I know how I'd like to put my fucking head. Thank you very much. Like there's a possibility that maybe she's seeing something, that if that extra degree was added or taken away, that suddenly light bulbs would go off and I'd go into Satori. But I've been doing this for long enough that just that's very unlikely, and I think it's unlikely for most people. I know that small. Anyway, my point is that the adjustment was maternal. Mm-hmm. It was parental. Mm-hmm. It wasn't content based. It wasn't alignment based. It was, I'm checking in with you, and I've got you. I'm holding you. I'm holding, and I look around, and there's 50 other people lying cuddled up in blankets and on bolsters, and I'm like, oh, people are coming to nap time in Lower Manhattan, and it feels really good. And this is a person who knows how to hold maternal space. And if we don't cop to that aspect of it, if we think, oh, we're there to work on alignment and the bandhas and the 3 layers of the perineum and how exactly to hold our hands in pranayama, if we don't realize, I would argue that if we don't realize that we are equally there to explore like the nursery space of early childhood and learning how to breathe and nap and sleep and move again in these very tender, intimate ways, I think we're missing it. And missing it, I think, is the blind spot with regard to abusive relationships.
So this is interesting. So what you're suggesting is not so much that the nurturing or maternal nature, as you put it, of the environment is what's problematic. But it's that we're not conscious of that dynamic.
We're not conscious. Yeah. By and large, we're not conscious. I think occasionally people colloquially refer to the coziness or the sweetness or the I was in the energy of the Divine Mother, but I don't think we make it literal for ourselves. I don't think we make it, this is how I was or wasn't regarded with a particular kind of gaze in my earliest memories. I don't think we go back there. Now, this is not the only model for understanding it, and I'm not saying that this psychoanalytic approach is like the end of the ball game. I think it has a lot to offer, though.
It's a lens that is important for us to put into the mix. Yeah,
I think so, and it's pretty uncomfortable because I think what it suggests is the content that so many yoga professionals spend their lives stressing about, trying to master, memorizing, researching, going to this workshop and that workshop, can actually be a cover, a kind of distraction for these deeper relational moments and energies that are being worked on. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that especially with the intimacy of asana class, it's you're literally learning how to move again. Yeah. And what could be more developmentally triggering but also enriching than that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I like what you say about, or I like what you're mentioning about just being conscious and aware of that kind of dynamic. Because I mean, I go to Jenny Capeller's class pretty frequently, and maybe I haven't thought about it in this way that you're suggesting necessarily. But when I think about it, and when you're speaking about it, I sort of recognize that there is definitely a kind of a nurturing quality to the environment that I'm drawn to, and while I can't necessarily, say how that connects necessarily to what my experiences were like with my mother, it's an interesting kind of conversation. But as long as I'm, willfully going into that context, and I understand that, like you're pointing out, that the gestures and the assists can be either content based or sort of based in this kind of more parental kind of mode. That's really the point, is to have that kind of awareness, a deeper kind of layer of awareness.
Yeah, I maybe I'd add that the content transmission of the adjustment and the relational transmission of the adjustment really can't be separated.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's that she might think from her loads of experience that degree tilt in my head is actually an important technical thing to show me, but her choice in doing it, the way in which she approaches me, the implied consent to do it, all of that is relational, and I don't think those two things can be separated. And one of the biggest obstacles to talking clearly about relational dynamics in yoga culture is this drive to say, well, we have to, in extreme cases especially, we really have to separate the teacher from the teaching. Right. And I'm like, no way. There is no, those things aren't separable. That we have 100 years or more of developmental psychology that says the way in which something is taught is the message, is the actual content.
Of course, yeah.
So when people are arguing about whether or not they should, what are they going to do with the hot 26 postures of Bikram yoga, given the fact that the guy's allegedly a serial rapist, that's a primary thing that comes up. Well, the thing can be separated out from the teacher. Mm-hmm. And I just doubt that it can be. Now, I'm not talking about everybody else who teaches Bikram yoga. If they have good relational, boundary stuff and good interpersonal dynamics with their students, then that might be fine and well. But him and the way he teaches and the content of what he teaches they're inseparable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because we're bodies, and bodies do things, and the bodies that do things are the content, and the content can't be separated from the bodies.
Yes. So what you're saying that each time the teaching is expressed by a different teacher, the content of the teaching is different?
I would say it has to be. It has to be. I mean, look at the wild transformations that have happened in just a few generations of Iyengar pedagogy. Mm-hmm. We have Judith Lassiter studying for years and years and years with the Guru himself, and then in '96, I believe, or '98, leaving the board of directors for the Iyengar Institute of San Francisco because Iyengar defended Manuso Manos, who admitted to sexually harassing his women students over a period of many years. Iyengar himself had him reinstated on the board. He was banned from the institute or dropped from the board and from the roster for a year. Iyengar had him put back down. Judith Lassiter resigns because of that. But she goes on to teach Iyengar yoga, but gradually changes things. And moves to the point at which she's writing books on nonviolent communication. Yeah. Which couldn't be farther from the zeitgeist that Iyengar either grew up with or promulgated in his illustrious career. Yeah. And so, but if we ask ourselves, what's the connection between what Iyengar taught and what Judith Lassiter taught. I'd have to say that there's got to be some overlapping elements, some blendings of things, but really, if she can be said to be teaching Iyengar yoga, it's really going to be her thing. It's going to be her version, her production of it, and that's going to come through her values, her embodiment, her feelings about consent. I mean, here's somebody who asks everybody every single time for consent before she touches or adjusts them. Every single time, like multiple times the same person during a class. So this is, I mean, to me, historically, this is fascinating, is that we have people who have developed yoga pedagogy while retaining some kind of connection to the teaching that they received as younger people. And then we have teachers who have completely abandoned what they received as younger learners and teachers and have struck out on their own. And I really enjoy researching the dialogue between those two groups.
And what do you think the stakes are in that? I mean, do you, like, for yourself personally, and maybe I know the answer to this, but I'd love to hear from you. Like, do you feel inclined to acknowledge your connection to the lineages you've been a part of, or are you more of the second group where you feel like you'd rather sort of overturn it and move on?
I have no problem talking about who I studied with and what I gained and what was awful about it. That's cool. As for what I've gone on to do in asana, I'm really not that sure about it anymore.
Yeah.
I haven't taught a weekly class in a couple of years now, and while I practice at home and when I'm teaching on the road, I'll facilitate restorative yoga classes. It's different from teaching an active class for sure, and I think I'd have to go back into training before I wanted to do it again, because I just don't. I have no idea what it I really don't. Yeah, I mean that's part of the joke of my book project is what I'm actually doing is I can say that I've been to several classes in the past couple of years with some masterful people who if I lived beside them, I would probably get back into learning how to practice and teach asana in a different way. Peter Blackaby is one of them, who comes to Toronto from Brighton once a year. I took a class with Maria Cristina Jimenez in Los Angeles that was fantastic. She's an osteopath now, I think. And then other movement modalities too, though, have kind of shocked me with regard to their complexity and beauty. Like Axis syllabus is just unbelievably beautiful.
Axis syllabus?
Yeah. It's a. I think the originator, Frey Faust, describes it as a movement research platform where it's mainly ex-dancers who have recovered, who have realized they have to recover from chronic injury. Getting together at various conferences around the world and figuring out, what's the most efficient way of crawling or rolling or spiral threading along the floor, or what are the mechanics of leaping and falling. And so there's a lot of overlap between Axis syllabus and contact improv world, and I've explored that a little bit. And so my asana basket is kind of exploded right now, and I don't know if it's going to come back together or how. But your question was, do you what's at stake in being a part of a teaching lineage or brand or not? And I think that it really depends on how the lineage conceives of itself. I mean, for Ashtanga people, there's this construction, or I would say reconstruction, of the notion of parampara, where you can't actually teach or be authorized in the method except through contact with a certain person's body, and that would be Sharath Joyce. I mean, the fact that there are no training programs for Ashtanga yoga outside of Mysore itself, it says something very beautiful and very ancient, but also very strange about this lineage. It says that the only person who is able to confer authority is Sharath Joyce, and it's only because he is a lineage character, or carrier rather. I suppose he's a lineage character too, but and he's a lineage character in a way that carries this very old meaning, I think, which overlaps with maybe tantric ideas of diksha or energetic transmission. Mm-hmm. And in many of the senior Ashtanga teachers that I've interviewed for my project, a lot of them say, "Oh yeah, Pattabhi Jois was a tantric yoga master, and when he laid across my back and his breath was in my ear, there was something very powerful that was being transmitted or communicated." And nobody has been able to do that for me, and it woke me up in a particular way, right?
Yeah, you don't seem like you'd be the kind of person to respond positively to breath in your ear in that way.
Well, I think the thing is, I think what makes me weird is that at certain points in my life I would have, and so I know what that is,
right?
I do know what that is. I was in two cults, and I had not close but powerful relationships with two cult leaders, and
And can you talk? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm really interested in, because we're having this conversation. You're so intelligent and so you're so analytical, and you're so thoughtful about your experience and the dynamics that are at play. So I don't understand who this Matthew Remski could have been that would have been in a cult and not have analyzed his way out of that box. Like what was that person, or who was that person at that time?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it plays on I think a fairly common fallacy around who joins cults, which is that there's some predictability around who's going to get involved and who's not going to get involved. I think the person who I haven't spoken to her a lot, but I really value her expertise. Her name is Kathleen Mann, and she's one of the few kind of court certified witnesses on cult dynamics and behaviors from a clinical psychology perspective, and so she goes to trials where people feel they've been abused, and she'll give testimony. But she she's pretty firm, and I believe her because she's in the research field, that there are no statistical predictors for who joins cults. My own sense for a long time was that in both of the environments that I was in, most of my colleagues were at a wandering time of their lives. Most of them were either completely detached from their families, or at least dissociated from their like lived circumstance in a number. There's a lot of people who were there, and then you found out after a couple of years that they actually had a wife and child back at home somewhere, and they hadn't really been in touch, and a lot of financial dysfunction. And so I had this general impression of people kind of sharing this aura of dysfunctionality. But looking back on it, I also realized that was I think that was a way of maybe rationalizing my own susceptibility. Like if I could say, oh, these particular experiences in childhood, or these particular traumas, or this kind of disaffection from my family was responsible for me winding up in this cult, then that kind of made me feel better. But I know that story isn't consistent for a bunch of people. So it might be a consoling narrative, but I don't think it really plays out. But you said how was I not self-aware? I think that's the stickiest question. In Geshe Michael Roach, I saw somebody initially who was very much like me. He was my height. He was my color. He would cry when listening to Neil Young. But he had exchanged his identity for the identity of a Tibetophile, and at a very sort of clear developmental stage, I think in his case at 22, he changed his life entirely, and I had done that as well. I left university when I was 22 to finish my novel, but also to engage with my partner at that time. I became a stepfather of a 4-year-old. I moved to Europe. I left everything behind. I had zero money and all of my possessions in a duffel bag, and when I think there was something about his story, divesting of everything at the age of 22 and having some intense psychospiritual experience with a teacher that gave me the sense of, oh, this is the other path that I could have taken, and the kind of love affair can arise in the heart of somebody who really idealizes the path a mentor has taken. And I think that was really clear for me. And I also just didn't know what to do with my life. I was probably clinically depressed. I was suffering from undiagnosed seizures at the time, so there was some kind of neurological illness going on, and I didn't have the culture or the self-awareness to really check it out or to monitor it. So I think there was just a lot of things going on in my early 20s that were profoundly destabilizing. And I think that ultimately I've wound up being grateful for, because I didn't funnel myself into a workaday, probably academic career was where I was going to be headed, and I don't think I'd be happy there.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot of things that you said that kind of resonated with my own experience, because we talked about this in our first interview, but my first teacher training was affiliated with Geshe Michael Roach. Yeah. And so I learned from a lot of teachers that were in his community. And I remember the main teacher trainer, she had mentioned that Geshe Michael Roach came to town. He came to Pure Yoga while we were in the teacher training, and she said that if we missed him, it would be like missing Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And I remember being very there were definitely alarm bells when I heard that. That's strange. That's a little bit weird. Why would someone say that? And feels a little culty to me. But I went, and it was a constant. I was really surrendering a lot of it's like what's that term where you surrender judgment, or you suspension of disbelief, like when you're like going to a theater, you're watching the theater or something.
Theater is a great metaphor to use here, actually.
Yeah, and the thing is, I was at the New School studying continental philosophy at the time, and so I was in an environment that should not have been whatsoever, or I was invested in a kind of intellectual practice that should not have been easily duped by something like Geshe Michael. I mean, it just doesn't. They don't seem to fit necessarily. Yeah. And yet, but I think it was the very fact of that kind of Western academic training, which sort of left me feeling spiritless. Yeah. That made it so attractive. And, totally. But I do remember when I went to see him, I was not impressed at all by his take on the Bhagavad Gita, which was like ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But then watching people deferentially bow to him when he's walking in the door was like really weird, hard to watch. But also, like, at the same time, the whole time I'm thinking, okay, there's a symbolic truth to this. There's like there's a philosophy behind why people are doing this. And that was another thing that I thought they had philosophies behind why they were doing things, which excused in a certain kind of way, the what would otherwise look like, cult-like behavior. Yeah.
Well, it's a fascinating scene that you paint, and I'm pretty familiar with it, and the attraction to something that feels intimate and present and impassioned and yet it also purports to have a philosophical basis is incredibly powerful, and I think it's a huge motivator in yoga culture, for sure, in a lot of different areas. It reminds me of this story that I heard from Dr. John Doyle. He was the medical faculty member for the Master of Yoga Studies at the Loyola Marymount College, I think. Yeah. And he did that for 1 year. Anyway, he got out of that. That's a long story, but he said that his own first yoga class came upon the heels of, or came within the period of time that he was gearing up to take his licensing exams to become a GP, a medical doctor. I think this is in LA. I think it's the late 70s, and I think he's also dealing with a number of emotional issues, but I think he has a friend who pulls him along to class, says, this will be great, this will straighten you out. The class is an Iyengar class. The person teaching begins referencing breath to the kidneys, and is pointing to the region just, in the center of the back, just below the shoulder blades, and John is like, this guy is totally full of shit. I was just in a cadaver lab the day before, holding a human kidney in my hand. This guy obviously doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what kidneys are, or where they are, or what they actually do. And he said, but at that moment, I realized that I needed something different than the medical education that I was getting, that was feeding one part of me and starving another. Yeah. And I think that it's such a common story, that we enter into yoga land and encounter a realm of poetry that we've either never had access to, or it jostles some deep childhood or perhaps cultural memory of a time in which not everything had to be measured, things didn't have to be footnoted, and we sang to each other around campfires or something like that. Like that's what we did. So there's almost a pre-rational memory that gets evoked and is extraordinarily powerful. And I think, going back to our early conversation, it draws upon embodied sensations that are primal to us. What does it feel like to be gazed at in the way that Geshe Michael gazed at people with those incredibly bright blue eyes and that 1,000-yard stare? Like that darshana, which is so crucial to the transmission processes within Indian wisdom traditions, the fact that it is centered upon the gaze, and that the gaze is the first and most tenderest thing that happens between parents and children, that's like, of course there are going to be primal sensations that come up. And that's what makes it, liberating and extraordinarily dangerous.
Mm-hmm. So, I like what you said about encountering poetry. I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. That, you enter the yoga world and you encounter a poetry that maybe you were starved for. So I guess then, in our in our more, critical conversations and all these kind of critical points about, what we need to be sensitive to in the yoga community, how do we retain that openness, that kind of openness to the poetry while still retaining this critical perspective that you advocate?
Yeah, I think it's a schizoid pursuit, really. That I'm hoping that in the book that I'm writing, I can go back and forth between those two things, because I was writing to the agent the other day that I'm trying to combine four types of diction in the book, and one is first person embodied. What does it actually feel like within me as I do asana? Eliding with what are other people telling me about their own interoception? Eliding with what are the interview subject narratives about their encounters in yoga land, and they're dealing with pain, injury, and healing, and then finally there's this straight up historical research, like what does Iyengar actually say about how much asana he learned from Krishnamacharya? Does everybody know that Pattabhi Jois described scenes of domestic abuse in his childhood home before fleeing to Mysore and encountering more of the same? Like, so I'm hoping that some sort of polyvocal approach will help with that. But for the most part, and this is really my bad. I've limited over the past, let's say, couple of years my online voice to cultural critique, and that's not my whole thing.
Right, and that's actually a question I wanted to ask you, because behind every cultural critic, there's someone who has a deep hope and idealistic temperament. You wouldn't be criticizing unless there was a vision that you had. So that I actually wanted to ask you before, and I think I kind of know. I think this very conversation is an answer in and of itself. But what is that vision for you? Like, what does the future of yoga look like when we've sort of grown up a bit?
Yeah. Well, there's so many things that come to mind, but I think that the thing that my brain is going to first and foremost is that relationally, people who teach and people who learn continue to evolve into deeper and deeper forms of interpersonal transparency and comfort. What I notice about, and this is really first of all on teachers. What I notice about teachers is a kind of chronic personality splitting and performativity that I think is amplified by the social media world. It's certainly amplified by photography, in which there's an overwhelming concern, or at least a chronic concern, around the self-presentation of hopefulness and inspiration that has its uses, but it's also not, the way we always feel. And
you mean,
and
are you talking about kind of the like new agey sort of like self-helpy stuff that we hear a lot? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, but I think it's easy to pick that stuff out. But I would say what's harder is picking out the somatics of authority and the performance of accomplishment.
Right.
You referenced in an email, you said, you enjoyed this dialogue that I was having with Christopher Wallace about who the new guru was. Well, he references, and I really appreciated talking with
it was a great conversation. Yeah,
Christopher, and we had a couple of phone conversations that were even more detailed that maybe will start to unfold in the future. But anyway, I respect and admire him in a number of different ways, because I think he's just in such a weird position, and being a scholar practitioner and having a kind of congregation, being a spiritual teacher at the same time. And I think he's figuring out how to do that in a way that nobody else has had to do it, with a kind of transparency that few others bring to it. So anyway, at least in yoga land, in the Buddhist world, it's a little bit different. I think they're 20 years ahead of us, but he references, in this question of, is there any value? He had this, he kind of accuses me of saying that, or suggesting that there is no value to spiritual teaching, or there shouldn't be spiritual teachers. And he says, but of course, people like Byron Katie and Adyashanti work. They work, and regardless of what anybody thinks of the content of Byron Katie's work, or the content of what Adyashanti says, the thing that occurs to me about that is that I think we have to get clear on how we feel in our bodies when we sit in a room of 300 people and Adyashanti is on a dais. Mm-hmm. What is that basic position of deference, or of it might not feel like deference. It might feel like rectitude. It might feel like piety. It might feel like receptiveness. But there's a way in which he as the figure is phallic. He is erect. And I mean this in all sense of the term, because there's a patriarchy inherent in the power dynamic of a single teacher and many potential recipients who are below. Now, he might position himself as not being anything special, or I haven't discovered anything. It doesn't matter what he says. If you turn on the video and turn off the sound, try to assess the somatics of what's happening and how it is that this person looks to carry or looks to be projecting something that other people don't have. And if we start having that conversation, now I don't know Adyashanti personally. I'm not saying anything good or bad about him. I'm saying that there is an accepted somatics of spiritual transmission and teaching that is rigid, that is uncomfortable, that is vertical in orientation, even when it says it's not. Even when it says content-wise, this is liberal, this is democratic, when you wake up, you just realize you're a regular person, all of that stuff. Look at how still the person sits. Look at how they look at other people. Look at the spatial dynamics of the room and see whether or not all of the focus is upon one body and why that is. Mm-hmm. And I think when we start having that somatic conversation about authority, spiritual authority, I think we'll start to understand how it is that we as teachers and students feel when we are trying to be good, which I would say is the primary obstacle in good self-inquiry.
Okay, so I want to ask a question about this because I think this is interesting. So then, just to compare it to maybe something else that we have less issues thinking about, or it provokes less kind of resistance. When I go to, if I was to be studying medicine, for example, I would go into a classroom with someone who did have knowledge that I don't have, and there's an inherent hierarchy there because I'm in a room seeking to learn a certain kind of technology. And so do you think that there's a way in which, or I guess what's the difference then between
that's a great question.
Somebody who has knowledge of a certain spiritual technology, what's different about those two contexts?
Well, it's not that the person has knowledge of spiritual technology, because if that were true, then we'd all be taking darshan with Alexis Sanderson at Oxford,
right.
The best read tantric scholar in the world. It's not about that. The presumption with Adyashanti or anybody else in that, or Byron Katie or anybody else that we turn to, is that they carry an experiential reality that other people don't, and that's what they grant access to. That's what I'm just agnostic about that. I don't know whether they do or they don't, but I'm pointing out that the presumption that they do creates a particular dynamic that I think we have to be aware of.
Which is funny. It's funny because I have read Adyashanti's book, and it's funny because it's like what you're pointing to is that there's an assumption that they have something, but then what they're teaching is that when you actually realize that you never had anything, that there was actually never anything to get.
I think you can read. I think you can read his books. I haven't. I think you can read Eckhart Tolle until you're blue in the face, and you can learn the lingo, you can learn the turns of phrase, you can learn the specialized, non-dualistic poetry. But I think you'll learn more about what's actually going on by feeling all the feels of sitting in the room with the person on the dais, staring the 1,000-yard stare. Like that and I think it's at once more immediate and more obvious what's going on, that this person has been endowed with a kind of presence that cannot be created by anything other than transference, because nobody can verify that Adyashanti is awake or even define what awake means. I mean, Christopher has a list of qualifications for awakeness, but it still doesn't get to the internality question of, well, did you do it? And the thing with Michael Roach and Adyashanti and Byron Katie is that they are telling you they did it. Yeah. But not only that they did it, but whatever it is they did has a particular meaning that is then universalizable, right? Mm-hmm. And I think if you're not clued into that, you're not gonna you may get swept away by the raw charisma of it. Now that might be helpful in the way that we just talked about, in terms of it'll moisten your academic bones maybe, but there are other some people will get carried away by another person's charisma for a very long time.
Yeah,
and it's there's a dynamic there. The one character in that beautiful Holy Hell documentary that just came out said, there's an economy between the traumatized narcissist and the codependent person who doesn't feel like they have a self. And I think really feeling what that feels like, means putting down the books and sitting in the room and going, oh, okay, why am I behaving so? Why am I so quiet? What gems of wisdom am I waiting for from this person? Why do I feel like it would be hugely embarrassing to belch really loudly right now? Like, why? You know what I mean? Like, what am I doing to repress my own body in order to be receptive to the image of my transference? So, yeah, I mean, I think that when you talk about the future of yoga, that's the conversation that I would love to see happen, because I think it would get beyond, but not only because yoga is primarily an embodiment practice globally, and so what we're doing with our bodies together and in relation to each other is really important, but also because I think it would get beneath the philosophical semantics a little bit, and maybe make our motivations for practice and relating to each other a little bit more clear. I don't know.
Yeah. Huh. So, I don't know if how I'm gonna frame this question, but I'm just sort of thinking, if we decide, we have this conversation, we decide that there's something sort of problematic about the pedagogical structure of a master teaching in this kind of hierarchical way. What is the alternative? Assuming that we still believe that there are people who have wisdom worth sharing, like what is the vision of a kind of context, a pedagogical context in which the wisdom is shared without falling into the problems that I think you're drawing attention to?
Well, I said earlier that the Buddhists are 20 years ahead of this, and I think this is evidenced by the fact that at most of the major meditation centers, some Zen centers, some Vipassana centers, IMS, places like that, across the states, the notion of a central teacher is downplayed or outright rejected, for one thing, and also there's always a board of directors. And also there is some kind of grievance or accountability process for student grievances. Mm-hmm. Those are basic structural changes that a lot of Buddhist organizations have put in place that I think are really useful and that Yoga Land could learn a lot from. Mm. I think the best story coming out of Yoga Land, both past and present, is the transformation of Kripalu from, a charismatic, top-down, guru-centered organization to something that is run by board and acclamation and democracy, now in some ways, the programming impacts for Kripalu are quite significant. For instance, they can't offer Amrita-sized meditation and motion anymore because only he really taught it, or associated with him, or it's based on a kind of Shaktipat ideal, which is of transmission, which is non-democratic by nature, right? It's vertical, and so they're not really doing that. And I remember talking to one of their board members who said, "Oh yeah, we can't offer that also because the insurance company doesn't like it either because we can't really define what it is." We as these places move, as yoga culture moves towards institutional intelligence, it's also probably going to lose some of its passion, and it'll have to be reconstituted in other ways, maybe in other projects, maybe passions for social justice and anti-oppression work will come in and soak up the passions that used to be directed towards the guru. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you think that is one of the other things that attracts you to the kind of Buddhist structure of things is that, and this I actually think is more aligned with Buddhist philosophy or the teachings of Buddhism, but like I'm thinking of Tara Brach, who, she often talks about her own failures or her own, psychological idiosyncrasies and how she struggles with all these same things. So there's a certain sense in which, even though she's, she's very well respected and people probably see her as, holding some kind of banner of wisdom or baton of wisdom that they don't quite have yet. But she's also very real. Like she talks about, she's just kind of a, she doesn't sort of present herself as being an awakened master in that way. Is that part of that Buddhist teachers are more inclined to be real about human suffering and human failings, or?
I think the vulnerability discourse pervades yoga culture as well. I just think that the structural safeguards against abuse just haven't been developed in yoga. I think that people are making vulnerability and fallibility into branding moves in yoga land. But that doesn't mean that the larger institutions, the larger schools, have taken the same measures that Buddhist organizations have taken to limit the power of individual teachers, or make sure that there's good feedback mechanisms, or not to bring out an old saw, but we have to ask ourselves, in the Jivamukti organization, who's the control? Who's the you said if you were going to a medical school, you would pursue somebody with expertise. That's very true. The person's expertise is going to be assessed by peer review,
right?
And that's there's like a whole process for that is intersubjective, it's interrelational, it's institutional with all of its baggage. It forms its own set of power dynamics, all of that stuff. But it's way different from Eckhart Tolle saying, I woke up on a park bench in Vancouver and I saw the light of God, and I want you to believe me, and now I'm on Oprah. Like, it's totally different. It's not self-reported. You can't self-report your surgical knowledge. Mm-hmm. You have to show it and not kill people. So I think the challenge for yoga schools is to figure out how to demonstrate skill in some kind of interpersonal, maybe not peer-reviewed way, because nobody's going to agree to that. But that's what the regulation discussion is about: is how are we actually going to understand and hold each other accountable for what we're actually doing.
Right. So the best case scenario in responding to the Jivamukti situation, scandal, whatever you want to call it, would in your view partly have been for Sharon and David to step down as sort of the leaders of the organization and put in place something like a board of directors that would then
that would have been a splendid move. Yeah. And why not?
Yeah.
And that would have been a splendid move. They're founders. They've created this vibrant technique, beloved around the world. They've done all kinds of good activism work, and they'll have a beloved following. And here might be an instance in which we have a personnel problem that brings up a couple of conflicts of interests for us, and we don't know exactly how to handle it. I mean, because the alternative was to simply call the accuser a liar, which is what they did, and instead of delegating, asking for a kind of institutional help, they kind of just, it seems like anyway, they made some top-down decisions, and who's going to, and unfortunately, the only accountability for that is going to be public and market-driven. So public is where if I play a journalistic role in telling that story, that's a form of public accountability, because there's no internal accountability, right? There's nobody. We're talking about a failed or aborted mediation process that Thoreau describes. It didn't work. There wasn't a way to redress what had happened. Mm-hmm. So she sought public remedy. And what's so the other thing that would be really cool about the board model or an accountability panel, or my friend Michael Stone has set up a council. I think he calls it an accountability council for he has people who study with him all over the world, and if they have complaints, he says, I'm going to delegate this to people who can give me feedback and offer remediation and decide on appropriate measures for healing broken relationships if it should come to that,
Wow.
or for trying to.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So he's got 3 people who form a council, and if you've got a problem with something that Michael said in class, or how he spoke to you personally, or something that happened in an email, or whatever, that's where you go to, and they make some sort of assessment, and there's some kind of process, but and who knows how I don't know how it's working. I haven't talked to him about it. It might be confidential, but at least there's like an effort to do something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I should say, just to be totally transparent, that people have asked me where my own accountability structure is, and who, if I'm doing interviews for this book, who do people complain to if they feel like they didn't like the interview process? And I think it's a great challenge. It's something that I've thought about a lot, but I haven't, I haven't been able to figure out how to frame an accountability process for writing a book. And for undertaking the kind of journalism that I'm doing. I mean, if I'm publishing, then the person who's publishing, which would be Decolonizing Yoga and the Jivamukti articles, is providing accountability and editorial. And if I go on to write for other publications, Yoga International or whatever, the same process applies there. But yeah, I think we've all got to think about, if somebody has a problem with what you're doing, with the ideas you're presenting, with how you're treating other people, who are they going to complain to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really important question, and at least that's something that you're sensitive to. It's and I think you're right, and I've really come. I wanted to get into this, and so I want to sort of move into just kind of some maybe observations from you in the kind of not aftermath, but the now that the Jivamukti thing is a little bit behind us, and I think when we had our second interview, I was very defensive and I was challenging you on a lot of things, and that weren't really very well founded. We did a very, very terrible job at being a critical interlocutor, but and I had to sort of question, afterwards why I felt so emotional about it, and even though Jivamukti it's a place that I started it's a place that I started practicing where I first fell in love with yoga. I actually was at the Jivamukti Yoga School in London when I was living there, going to school over there. Which has a very different vibe. It doesn't have the same, because Sharon and David aren't really, it's not their home base, so to speak. But I never had a relationship with Sharon and David, and I've only taken David's class once, and and they always felt a little bit, like they weren't available or weren't there. I never really felt that connected to them, but I had a lot of teachers that really, really very transformative for me, and I have a lot of friends that teach there. Something that we discussed. So living in New York, I mean, you can't really go anywhere without as a yoga teacher without being around Jivamukti teachers. So the whole kind of culture in the city was one of a lot of conflict, because there's a lot of and so I guess afterwards, I really had to kind of think about why I was so resistant to whatever it was that I saw you as doing, and I think it was just that I was just dealing with my own kind of mourning process, because even though again I don't consider Jivamukti my home studio. I actually don't even really like the style so much anymore, and I don't really like the way the Dharma talks are done, although I have a few people that I think are great teachers. But Ruth was definitely somebody that I really loved, and I took her class a lot. And so there was like it was really hard for me to kind of to even acknowledge that I was emotionally invested in that whole thing, and that I had a kind of desire to see Ruth in a kind of way that was destroyed by the whole experience. And so it's a little bit of a trauma. It's a little bit of a mourning process that has to be gone through. And I think I was sort of not even consciously in the middle of it when we spoke last. So I just wanted to kind of be upfront about that.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think it's a very powerful reflection. And if it was your first encounter with asana, that's like, that's a profound thing. and as careful, as difficult as it is to negotiate the language around defining cult dynamics is, and as sensitive as one can be in doing it, is if a person has had a powerful experience and that they begin to wonder whether or not either that experience was the same for everybody, or whether what was, or they become confused about, oh, well, this was very powerful for me. How can I cognitively, integrate the fact that it was terrible for somebody else, to the point of being abusive? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance that can come up for sure, because, and I think that speaks to the power of the BAV, the mood in the room. It speaks to the power of the brand and the culture that's created, mm-hmm. because it overwhelmingly suggests that you are in loving care. That you are, and if that's resonant with your experience, it's very strange to hear something else, or to hear something else and to have it made, and to have your own experience be made ambivalent in some way, or So anyway, I just really I appreciate your description of that, because I've been in this position a fair amount, the number of people who were very, kind of mystified by the events surrounding Michael Roach, and then I did some writing on Usara. The same thing comes up, which is. These lineages, these brands, these environments are powerful. Yeah, they're powerful, and they can be powerfully healing. Mm-hmm. And it's so difficult to see that what makes them powerfully healing is as much what we bring as what they actually are. But maybe there's also a step towards pride in there as well. It's like, oh, you asked me, you said how did such an analytical person get wrapped up in two cults? And I'm like, well, I needed them in many ways, but also I count myself very privileged actually to be relatively intact. And I think it's because I didn't enter with a completely destroyed sense of self. Right. And so if that's your entry point, you are not, recovering from heroin addiction. You are not, coming out of, physical abuse with a spouse. You are not scraping the bottom of your life. If you're not doing that, and yet you entered into a practice environment that opened you up, that gave you all kinds of wonderful things, and you were able to leave when the time came. It's a very different experience than the person who felt very dependent upon that thing, and then perhaps reenacted the constellation of their dependency through that organization.
That's really interesting. And, you're saying, if you didn't go into this practice from a destroyed sense of self, but really that is so many people's story. I mean, totally. You look at a who's who of bios for yoga teachers, and that's like the number one part of the narrative is like, I was in this car accident and I was depressed and drinking every day, and then I found yoga, totally. this it's almost like par for the course that somebody is finding some kind of solution. And even myself, I mean, I've been practicing yoga for many years now, but what I actually, right when I took my teacher training was right after I had stopped drinking, and I stopped drinking for about 3 years because I had drug problems for many years before that, for all of those years. So, and I was practicing yoga at the time, but I went into kind of this new yoga teaching thing from a place of kind of having to reinvent or learn who I was again, after totally. Kind of being totally entangled in this in this experience. So it's a very real, it's a big reality, and probably more often than not, people are finding yoga as a solution from this kind of, destroyed existential place like you're talking about.
Totally, and I think the process of exchanging one type of addiction for another is something that is very. It's a subtle thing to look at. I think it's a really important thing to look at, but to the extent that some of our dependency transfers over to the person who's teaching us or to the practice that we're doing, is the extent to which I don't know, some of the promised empowerment might not arrive on time. Mm-hmm. And yes, you're right. I mean, the stories of especially the shifting of addictions is huge. Yeah. Where suddenly the new community is not the drinking community, but the yoga community, and the passion is not red wine, but veganism. And do you know what I mean? Like, I asked Gabor Mate once in an interview. I said, "What is there such thing as a positive addiction?" And he looked at me like I was from Mars. Like, what are you talking about? There are no positive addictions. Mm-hmm. But then I think it's Bill Glasser, the clinical psychologist, who actually has a whole book called Positive Addictions, which studies this thing of how we can transition from incredibly self-destructive behaviors to less self-destructive behaviors, but not entirely become, fully agented or autonomous or settled in the self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I mean, even, a favorable reading, not a reading that would probably be true historically, but a favorable reading of the sutras would be, cultivating, or yoga philosophy would be, cultivating better habits, and then ultimately being able to not be attached even to those better habits, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah, which brings up the question is, in the end, what is this practice going to be for? Yeah. When the asana is not so interesting anymore, or we can't do it, when we've meditated and explored self-regulation and altered states of consciousness, what will we be able to go out and do then? Like, how will this self-work make us more loving? I think that's what I try to. Yeah. That's what I try to keep my eye on.
Yeah, me too. Wow. Well, Matthew, this has been really great. I think it's our best one yet.
Yeah.
I hope you think so too.
I do. It's a real pleasure. Thanks so much for the time and the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, before we get off the line, do you want to share anything that's coming up for you? Any projects, any workshops? Are you going to be anywhere specific that people might want to check you out?
Yeah, I mean, the schedule tab on my website is pretty good. I know that there's a number of meditation immersions that I'm facilitating. Edmonton is tomorrow, then I'm in Lacombe, Alberta, and then Coeur d'Alene in October, and Portland in November.
Awesome.
But I'm also you're in New York, and I think you have a lot of New York listeners. I'm coming to Yoga Works Midtown on the 14th and 15th, I think, of October.
Oh, amazing! I teach at Yoga Works.
Yeah. And Laurel Beversdorf and Tamar Samir are going to be providing me with asana backup, which I need because I just confessed that I don't teach active classes anymore. But the topic is from the Wawadia research, and it's focused around a natural history of the body in yoga practice. So hopefully that'll be interesting to some of your listeners. But my schedule is pretty good.
So what date was that?
I think it's October. Let me just see here. It is October 15th and 16th.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, it's 12 to 6 each day.
Excellent. It's such a small yoga world. Tamar Samir is assisting you. She was just in my apartment a few weeks ago for one of our living room lectures.
Very good.
She's a good friend of mine.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Matthew, and I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Take care, Jacob.
Bye-bye. All right. That was our interview with Matthew Remski. I hope you enjoyed it. again, if you are interested, if you liked what you heard and you want to take those courses with Matthew from our masterclass collection, you can check out the one of two courses he's done. One is called Transcendent Urges, Brilliant Anxiety in the Yoga Sutras, and the other is called Arjuna and Climate Change, a thought experiment inspired by the Bhagavad Gita. And then, of course, if you are interested in following Matthew and finding out about his schedule and any of his upcoming programs, do check out MatthewRemski.com. All right, thanks so much, friends. Bye-bye.